Mating var agus fáilte arás gan vlog agam jo fáilte ha úr a seo as mise rénit agus mise as the fresh question. Good morning everyone and welcome back to my vlog, or welcome to the channel if you're new here. If you feel like a YouTuber, like and subscribe, click the buttons and all that stuff. Yeah, I'm bad at this. Anyway, my name is Rachel and this is another episode, the 4th episode of Reddit Answers Quora's Questions. So today the questions come from the Quora space subcategory, whatever the terminology is, called Scottish Gaelic in brackets language. And as always, if you're a Gaelic speaker, don't go searching this up unless you're feeling very strong and stable, because some of the questions are not great, a lot of the answers are very not great, they can be quite confronting, quite triggering, quite frustrating, and basically you don't need more of that in your life. You already get it unsolicited on your Twitter and Facebook feeds and in the newspapers and from random old people on the street who don't like seeing your language or hearing your language and having it anywhere around them. So, moving on with Ceist Hun is the root of Irish Gaelic, same as Scottish Gaelic. And I've already basically done 2 videos on the similarity of Irish and Scottish Gaelic, and I've also answered this in one of the previous Quora questions videos. But basically, yes, the root of Irish and Scottish Gaelic are the same. They're descended from... I don't think we say Common Gaelic. What do we say? Middle Irish? Classical Gaelic, that's the word we use. So they begun diverging about 1,000 years ago, but were basically held together by a common educated register, a common literary tradition, which is called Classical Gaelic, which continued to be used up until about 200 years ago, although by that point, obviously, Irish and Scottish had, quite different vernaculars. But yeah, that was the last common ancestor, which was about 1,000 years ago. Ceist Ra. Does anyone speak Scottish Gaelic? Yes, people speak Scottish Gaelic. Ha Gaelic agam. Is me Gaelic. Is me Gaelic. The right side to do the hashtag on. Anyway. Ceist 3. Did any part of Wales speak Gaelic, like Dyfed or Gwynedd? My apologies if I'm pronouncing the Welsh wrong, but that is a very interesting question. I don't know. Probably not, but I do know that ogham stones have been found in various bits of Wales, and ogham stones are very much associated with Old Irish, Ceann Gaelic as a language, which makes me think that maybe there were, even if it weren't widely spoken, there must have been Ceann Gaelic speakers. And actually, St. Patrick, was Welsh. He was from the Hen Ogledd, the old North Wales, which may well have been Lowland Scotland. Anyway, I digress. He was Welsh. He was captured by Irish pirates from his home in probably Wales and taken to Ireland. So there were at the very least Irish-speaking pirates around the coast of Wales at some point. So, I guess bits of Wales did have Gaelic speakers in them. But I don't want to say that for sure, and definitely don't use this as an excuse to claim that Welsh as a language doesn't have any right to be there or anything, because it would very much be that Gaelic would be the language that didn't have a right to be there, and Welsh is a great language, and my favourite language, really. I just don't speak it, but it sounds cool. Ceist. Why could Scotland's Gaelic language die out in 10 years? Now, I did notice no one answering this question seemed to take this as anything other than, yeah, Gaelic's definitely gonna die. It's a stupid dead language that shouldn't be spoken and taking my taxpayer money. But I'm assuming that the question is prompted by the Gaelic Crisis in a Vernacular Community study that came out almost 2 years ago now, mid 2020. And it was used by a lot of anti-Gaelic people to say it is going to die in 10 years, forget about it already. And sort of used as another battering ram against Gaelic speakers, which wasn't the point of the book at all. And I fear that the point of the book has been very much overlooked and missed and not acted on by a lot of people. But basically, the premise of it, and I haven't actually read it, I have to admit, I haven't read it. But the point of it was saying that based on the current trajectory of towns and areas where Gaelic is still spoken as the first and primary language of the area, there will no longer be any towns where it is the default language in the community in 10 years. And this was published 2 years ago, so that's now 8 years, which is a scary thing. And it's basically saying there will no longer be any places where if you go into a shop, they're going to assume that you speak Gaelic. So definitely there is a lot of work that needs to be done, strengthening areas that are still Gaelic speaking as a default community language, strengthening areas that were recently Gaelic speaking as the default community language, and also strengthening the confidence that speakers have to be using it out and about in public. Which is obviously not helped by people who don't speak Gaelic using a book like this as a battering ram to tell us to shut up and stop speaking Gaelic. But yes, it's not the same thing as the language dying. There are still speakers. There are children who speak it. There are young people who speak it. There are people my age who speak it and hopefully going to have children in the next couple of years and speak it to them. So it's not going to die as a language. It's still going to be spoken. It's still going to have native speakers. But the ways in which it is spoken will, if there isn't intervention done, which unfortunately doesn't look like enough intervention will be made, it will no longer be the case that there will be a village or a town where everyone speaks Gaelic and everyone speaks Gaelic to each other out and about, and it will be more the case that we see in established communities like this in Glasgow, for example, in Cape Breton, where there is a Gaelic speaking community. There are community locations, shops, pubs, schools, where if you go into that particular place, people will assume you speak Gaelic and speak Gaelic to you. And families network with each other, socialise with each other. But it's what's called a networking language rather than a community language. So, it's still spoken and there's still native speakers, but it's not the default language of the area. It's like there's a network of Gaelic being superimposed onto an English landscape. So that's what that study was about. And it's basically why it could die out, why it will, unless there's intervention, die as a community language, is basically because speakers have been shamed into not speaking it, unless they're confident that the other person also speaks it. They live in areas where you're 100% sure that everyone you run across speaks and understands English, but you're not 100% sure that everyone you run across speaks and understands Gaelic. So you're going to default to English because you'll know you'll be understood. So you get situations where two Gaelic speakers will be speaking English to each other and might not know that the other speaks Gaelic because they're defaulting to English because they know they definitely will be understood in English. And also because there's trouble in, a lot of these communities where it is still spoken or was still spoken until recently as a community language, areas that are very popular for second home owners and holiday makers, which makes it very difficult for people who have grown up in that area to speak Gaelic as their first language and want to still speak it to their children to buy housing in that area and stay in that area. So you do get a lot of in-migration from non-Gaelic speakers who may or may not learn the language, and locals from the area who do speak it often end up living in Inverness or Glasgow, where they join the Gaelic network community rather than the sort of the Gaelic default community, as it were. So, yeah, that's basically why it's facing trouble as a community language. So, Ceist and Gaelic. Are Galician and Gaelic the same? No. Galician is spoken in. If you picture a map of Spain and Portugal, so drawing this, and there's Portugal's a corner. Galicia is the bit like on top of Portugal. So they speak a Romance language that is similar to Portuguese. And this is obviously not the same thing as Gaelic, which is a Celtic language. But the Iberian Peninsula, they did speak a Celtic language pre-Roman invasion, pre-Roman settlement. I'm not sure exactly how that went down. And Galicia purports to be the area where the Celtic language held out for the longest. I do believe there's some evidence of a Celtic language still being spoken there until about the 12th century. I'm pulling these numbers from a shelf at the back of my head that's very dusty, so I may well be wrong on that. And they're called Galician because words like Gal and Galish are used for a lot of Celtic people groups, like the Galatians in Turkey, the Gauls of Asterix, and the Gaels, and of course in Galicia. So they're not the same language, but that's why they call their language Galician, but it's not a Gaelic language, it's a Romance language. Similar question. Ceist Shia. Why is Scotland in Gaelic called Albany, when the word itself is a loan from Latin? Do you know if they had a native name from the region? Your question is flawed. Scotland in Gaelic is not called Albany, it's called Alba, which is the native name for the region. I don't know what the Pictish word would have been, if indeed there was a Pictish word for the whole of Scotland, but Gaelic, Alba is the word for it in Gaelic, and I do know that the Cornish word is Alban. In fact, I think in all the Brittonic languages they have a word like Alban or Alaban for Scotland, so I would suggest that the Pictish word would probably have been similar. Yeah, it's not a loan word from Latin. I'm not sure what exactly the etymology is, but I don't think it's the same as the Latin one. So yeah, Alba is the native name for the region. I think there's time for one more question. So, Ceist Shach. Is it true that in Irish Gaelic there are no words for yes and no? Why this question was being asked in the section called Scottish Gaelic, I'm not sure. But yes, it's true, there's no words for yes and no. We have no need of them. They complicate life. You would think, probably coming from an English speaking perspective, that they simplify life, but they don't. If your mum says to you, this is an example I came up with as a teenager, which is why it's very much geared to people going to school. If your mum says to you, "Are you not going to school today?" in English, is the answer yes or no? No, I'm not going to school today? Yes, you were correct. I'm not going to school today. It could go either way, and whatever answer you give could be interpreted in a different way to what you mean. In Gaelic and in Irish, no confusion. You say not going or going. So instead of yes and no, basically we echo the main verb of the sentence back, and with the negative or affirmative article attached to it. So it basically avoids a lot of confusion, but it does mean that you have to pay better attention when you're listening because you need to know what the verb is. And yeah, that's it for today. Sirin drastig, schiemische wolle en